now, but anyway, we'll go ahead and start. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. I'm Sarah, and I work for the Regulator events, for the events at the Regulator Bookshop here in Durham, North Carolina. And I think we have attendees from near and far. So if you join later, please go ahead and let us know where you're from. We're interested to see where everyone is from. We're honored to welcome tonight's guests, A. Kirsten Mullen and William A. Darity Jr., authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, as well as John Tateishi, the author of Redress, the inside story of the successful campaign for Japanese American Reparations. I just have a few short announcements before we get going. When you enter the event, your mic was muted, so please make sure to go either back on mute or stay on mute during the presentation so that everybody can hear. Let's see, if time permits, which it should, there'll be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. So please write your questions in the chat after when they ask for questions, go ahead and write them in the group chat. There are a lot of you, so try to limit after we kind of let each other know where we are. And unless there's any problems, try to limit the chatting to the questions and try to only ask one question. We're about limited to an hour and a half, and so we do apologize if people's questions don't get answered. So yeah, again, type where you're from in the chat before we get going. The Regulator is not open for in-store shopping at this time, but we have a great web store at regulatorbookshop.com where you can purchase the books we're focusing on tonight, and of course, lots more. We offer curbside pickup Monday to Saturday from noon to 4 p.m., as well as UPS shipping and also delivery to Durham, Chapel Hill, and Carrboro. When I'm done talking, I'm going to add the specific link to both these books that you like in a bookstore. And thanks also to UNC Press and Heyday Publishing for publishing the books. So I'd like to again welcome our speakers for tonight. William A. Darity Jr. is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics at Duke University. A. Kirsten Mullen is a writer, folklorist, museum consultant, and lecturer whose work focuses on race, art, history, and politics. John Tateishi was born in Los Angeles in 1939 and was incarcerated from ages 3 to 6 at Manzanar, one of America's 10 World War II concentration camps. He studied English literature at UC Berkeley and attended UC Davis for graduate studies. He played important roles in leading the campaign for Japanese American Redress. And as the director of the Japanese American Citizens League, he used the lessons from the campaign to help ensure that the rights of the nation's Arab and Muslim communities were protected during 9/11. So thanks again, and I will turn the microphone over to our speakers.
I guess I'll start. I'm John. I thank you very much, Sarah, for inviting me to join you from California to Durham. It's really nice to be able to share this with so many people. And thank you especially to Sandy and Kirsten for inviting me to share the time with them to talk about our books. This event is really about their book. And the interest of this evening is on Black reparations. I'm here to perhaps add some information that might be helpful in thinking about strategies or to consider where the Black reparations issue moves from point to point based on some of the successes and problems we had with the Japanese American issue when we ran our reparations campaign. So what I'd like to do is start with their book and to talk about the content of it. I have to say that I started reading this, I consider myself fairly well informed. Um, I started reading this book and was stunned by the information in it, how much there was, and how thoroughly they had researched so much of this book. And in talking with them a couple days ago, I found out it took them 9 years to do the research and to write this book. What's really interesting about the book to me is there's a kind of arc to it. It starts talking about the situation in today's world for Black Americans. And then it goes back to talking about slavery, the things that have had an impact on who Black Americans are today. And so it goes back to talking about slavery and goes from there to the Declaration of Independence and to the Civil War, to Reconstruction, and then from there to Jim Crow, and moves into the 20th century. But at every point, it talks about the failures of the institutions in America to prevent or to assuage the problem of slavery. And we are what we are as a nation today as a result of all of those failures. It's a really amazing book. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to buy it and read it. It's one of those books you read, and for me, it was like almost every page I was thinking, my reaction was, oh my God, how do we do this? How does this nation really get away with doing everything it's done? And so I'd like to start with asking you about why you wrote this book. And when we talked, the three of us, we were talking in general, but as I thought about it later, I started wondering what it was that prompted you to write this book. If it was 9 years ago, that would have been 2011, before the current interest started evolving from the Atlantic article by Coates. And so this was way ahead of that. And I'm wondering what it was that prompted you to write something so complete about the whole history of Black America.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, John. I'll start. I grew up in a family in Fort Worth, Texas, that we used to sort of laugh and say that race was like a member of the family. And we were always trying to figure out, why things were the way they were. The community I grew up in was a family of working Black people. I knew that they were smart. I knew that they were, persevering, and yet, they had so little, in the way of material things to show for it. And it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. But this was something that I was always, kind of primed to be aware of and to be thinking about as a kid. And then I was actually in the class in Texas that integrated the schools. Texas did a crazy thing. They integrated the schools by year. And so every year I and all of my classmates were in the group that was, moving through the schools. And again, having had the first, handful of years of school in segregation, and then suddenly everything else is in integration. You were always aware of how things were different in the Black school and how they were different for my Black peers. So I think, the awareness that something was wrong was always there, but not really understanding, how we got to here. Could it be any different? Was it different for anyone else? I think about, when, in my work, I'm always writing about race and writing about tradition and trying to understand, how people keep themselves together. How do we determine what our values are as a people, and how we present ourselves, to each other, and how we present ourselves to the public. And that has a lot to do with, the things that have happened to us, not just the things that we've been able to make happen ourselves. So I think for me, in my family, thinking too on my father's side, when we took our older son, an infant, to meet my grandfather, he held him in the air and pronounced him the fifth generation. And I didn't really understand at first what he meant. This is northwestern Alabama. And what he meant was the fifth generation born since slavery, which wasn't on my mind at all. I didn't grow up in Alabama. I grew up in Texas. But here is someone, a big part of my family, who grew up within a stone's throw of the white people who owned them. And I think in a lot of cases, reminded them every day that they had owned them. And so, just some very different ways that both sides of my family were conscious of, or made conscious of, who they were, what their place was or wasn't in the world. So I think I was primed for it, and we had begun to write together and separately about reparations, I think as early as 2005. But Sandy has an even earlier, well, I should say two, that we marched with my mother from the time I was about 7 in Fort Worth, Texas, especially the summer after Viola Liuzzo and Father Myron Daniels were murdered in Alabama. And that was a very, strange and disorienting thing for me. I had always been told, never find yourself in the company solely of white people, be very afraid. And my mother was a school teacher, public school teacher, and she and many of her friends who themselves were teachers had all planned to march, to be present for the march. But when we got there, we were the only Black people there in this sea of white people. And, we started, making our way to the rallying auditorium. And, these young white people said to my mother, you all move to the middle of the street, because there were people along the edges with bats and chains, and bottles, they were spitting on us. And they said, you all move to the middle, so that you'll be a little more protected. But I can remember just being very confused, because we'd been told, to be wary of white people, and yet here were white people protecting us from other white people. Anyway, just a lot of confluence of a lot of things. I think I was very observant as a child and still am, and have always been trying to problem solve and kind of understand the world. And this book was a one way for us to try to kind of unpackage some of the things that we have experienced and stories that have been passed down to us, but also lessons that we received formally through our education.
You may want to mention how many generations you're away from slavery on your mother's side.
Yes. So on my mother's side, I'm only 3 generations away from slavery.
Wow.
Yes, absolutely. My grandmother's father, my mother, and I knew her very well, knew her, much of my adult life, but her father had been enslaved. Mm-hmm. So it's not that far away for us.
Yeah, I think like Kirsten's family, race was always part of the dinner conversation. And my mother in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, would take my sister and me on marches during the early 1960s. So in that sense, there's a lot of similarity in terms of our experiences. On my mother's side, I would be the 4th generation from slavery. My great-grandmother, who I knew, she was alive for upwards of the first 10 years of my life. My great-grandmother was the daughter of 2 individuals who were enslaved on Rose Hill Plantation in North Carolina. But I think that what was really critical for me in terms of the project here was a chain of events that took place in 1989. I was approached by a researcher named Richard America, and this is truly his name, Richard Franklin America. And he was preparing a book which was subsequently called The Wealth of Races, which was an edited compendium of papers by economists who were attempting to estimate what the cost of a reparations program would be for Black Americans. And Richard asked me if I would write the introduction to this. And I told him, well, Richard, and this was a phase of my life when I was a reparations skeptic. I said, Richard, I don't believe this will ever happen. It certainly is morally or ethically the right thing to do, but it's just not going to happen. So why should we waste our time trying to calculate what the size of the bill is for something that's never going to occur? And Richard, with some sort of prescience or wisdom, said to me, I want you to write this introduction. You can say whatever you please. You can say that this is a ridiculous project if you prefer, but I want you to read the essays and write the introduction. And so in the process of reading these essays, I became increasingly not only incensed, but also increasingly convinced that even if this was something that was unlikely to occur, it was the only way to address the glaring inequalities that exist in American society with respect to race. And so I moved in that direction, as a consequence of working on this particular introduction to this volume. I moved in the direction of becoming an advocate of reparations and also somebody who was trying to do serious research on reparations. And so I guess that's what, it was about 2010 or so, I gave a presentation at UNC Chapel Hill on reparations. In spring. And one of the editors from the University of North Carolina Press heard me give the presentation. She comes up and she says, you should do a book. And she was fairly persuasive. And I immediately asked Kirsten if she would work on it with me because we had been thinking about these issues for a while. And so that's how the collaboration began. We were hopeful that the book would have an impact that might stir a conversation about reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery. We didn't anticipate that, Ta-Nehisi Coates gave a talk at Duke in which he said he was working on an article on reparations. And this was after we had begun the process of working on our book. So we didn't anticipate that there would be much more serious attention that would be drawn to reparations as a consequence of the article that he prepared. And then in 2019, there were actually presidential candidates who made a commitment to saying that they were in favor of reparations, which was absolutely astonishing to us. Three of them, Marianne Williamson, Julian Castro, and Tom Steyer. And then this year, in the aftermath of the tragedy that took place in Minnesota, as well as I think the pressures and tensions of the coronavirus crisis, we've had even more attention drawn to questions of structural racism and reparations. And so, completely surprising to us, our book came out in an environment in which I think people are actually interested in learning more about the subject.
Well, it's really interesting because this book, to me, was like a punch in the gut. I mean, I started reading it, and the first couple of chapters they're really thought-provoking. But once you get beyond that into that deeper research that you've done about the Civil War and about slavery and leading up to the Civil War, page after page, it's unbelievable, the kinds of information. As I said, I consider myself fairly well informed, but this book was such a revelation to me. I have always been a skeptic. From the first time I was asked that question during the Japanese American Redress campaign, what do you think about Black reparations? It was an inevitable question. And I would always say, I think there ought to be, but I don't know how. I really don't have a sense of how to achieve something that monumental. For us, we were in World War II, there were 120,000 Japanese Americans. We were very easily identified. We're sitting on the West Coast, mainly in California, and they had the government had violated the law and used census material to identify exactly who was where. And so Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the FBI swept through our communities, went to individual homes and arrested people. But in total, there were 120,000 of us affected. And when it was all said and done, it was over $2 billion. So as I would get asked that question about Black reparations, I had no idea how this would even begin to be considered. How do you calculate such large numbers? I mean, we're talking about millions of descendants of slaves living in America. And how do you calculate the numbers to come to what's equitable and that will resolve certain issues that continue to exist in this country? And so my skepticism changed in May of this year, May 25th, when George Floyd was murdered. And I sensed something changing in this country. And after reading your book, it's almost like, oh, I know the formula. I know how this can be done. I don't, but it gives a whole different sense of why it needs to be done and how it could be possibly calculated so that it does have meaning. For us, it was over $2 billion. We are, of course, talking about trillions of dollars in the case of Black reparations. But the argument is so clear as you read through the book, because it's incident after incident. And you talk about throughout the book about the opportunities, the roads not taken, and how this could have been resolved early on, but the choice was not to change the situation. And so the whole country was complicit in this. I mean, it wasn't just the South. As you point out, it was the North, because there were economically, that's where a lot of the money came from. So I wonder, can you just kind of summarize what those roads not taken were, where the changes could have been? And I have to tell you, I know Reconstruction was a mess. It was a total failure. Reconstruction led to Jim Crow. But there are so many facets to that failure. And as I read through all of this and look at like slavery and what was happening and the Civil War and how there could have been changes at certain points, I wasn't aware of all of that and how it could have changed the lives of Black Americans. So I wonder if you could just kind of summarize that and get us more towards this concept of Black reparations. Or is that too big a question?
No.
We'll take turns.
We'll go back and forth. Okay. So,
okay.
No, you are correct, John. I mean, there were many forks in the road, numerous opportunities that this country has had to construct full citizenship for Black descendants of U.S. slavery. I want to just focus briefly on one of those, and this would be the fate of the newly emancipated Black people after the Civil War, just immediately after the war. So General William Sherman's Special Field Orders number 15 were directives that authorized the redistribution of the land abandoned by and confiscated from the Confederate rebels, right? And these are people who had fought against the Union. And so I want to read just a bit from Here to Equality on this topic.
Are you talking about the Port Royal experiment?
So Port Royal is fascinating too, in that Port Royal was an experiment that the federal government was running even while the Civil War was underway. As early as 1961, along the South Sea Islands in South Carolina, there were government agents who were working with the contraband, because these are folks who had been, something like 17,000 formerly enslaved people had been just abandoned The whites who had enslaved them, got on trains, carriages. They took what they could, but they could not transport all those people, and so they just left them. They left them there. And John asked about Port Royal, and so the government was in communication with them, put them in houses, and they began to work on the crops that were in the ground and to seed new crops. And they were wildly successful. It was a very, it was all that was hoped for and more. They were able to deliver their products to the federal government for a fixed fee, which had never happened. In every way that one would measure success, the Port Royal experiments did exactly what they were supposed to do. But I'm talking about the point, as the war is winding down, and this is 1865. And so we have General Sherman, so I'm talking about General Sherman's plan. So a lot of people think about the 40 acres and the mule as part of folklore, but in fact, that promise was much more than a figment of Black people's imagination. It was the centerpiece of, a very bold federal plan.
Yeah, and as we always say, how Black folklore is true.
That's true, yeah. The edges maybe you tweak the edges, but the kernel of the story we find is almost always right on the money. So Sherman's plan had begun to take shape in January 1865, 3 months before the final battle of the Civil War was fought, when he and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton met in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 other leaders, ministers and church officers primarily. They had met to discuss the plight of the state's freedmen. The leaders selected former slave and Granville County, North Carolina native Reverend Garrison Frazier, who was 67 years of age and a minister for 35 years. They selected him to be their spokesperson. He had managed to purchase his and his wife's freedom 8 years earlier with $1,000 in silver and gold. When asked to define the institution of slavery and to state his understanding of the Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln had issued January 1st, 1863, Reverend Frazier replied, and I quote, "Slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another man and not by his consent. The freedom, as I understand it," he continued, "promised by the proclamation is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor, take care of ourselves, and assist the government in maintaining our freedom," end quote. When asked how the freedmen proposed to provide a livelihood for themselves, Reverend Frazier responded, quote, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor. That is, by the labor of the women and men and children, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And to assist the government, the young men should enlist in the service of the government and serve in such manner as they may be wanted. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own," end quote. When asked if he preferred to live among whites or solely among Blacks, Reverend Frazier indicated that while he could not speak for the other ministers, he preferred to live among Blacks, quote, "For there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over," end quote. When questioned separately, all but one of the ministers, freeborn Baltimore, Maryland native James Lynch, 26 years of age, indicated that they would prefer to live among only other Blacks. So continuing, in fact, these newly emancipated Black people did not receive their 40-acre land grants. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson becomes president. He reverses, Sherman's order. He begins to readmit. First, he begins to pardon the Confederate officers. He not only pardons them, but he instructs the Freedmen's Bureau and the military to return the land that they had abandoned, that had been confiscated from them, back to them. And basically by that Christmas, things were, pretty much back to normal for these Southern officers. So less widely known is that starting in 1862, under the Homestead Acts, 1.5 million white households received 287 million acres of land in the Western territories. So, this is land that had only recently been inhabited by Native Americans or indigenous people. So research conducted by the U.S. Department of Interior and Jennifer Mueller and Trina Shanks Williams indicates that this, what Neil Kashkari, Neil is the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, calls free equity. So this land mass equivalent would be all of the West Coast. So the land was not, that far west, but we're talking about a land mass that would have included all of Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, and Massachusetts combined, or all of Texas and all of California. That's about 287 million acres. Okay? So, one could farm the land. It was a tax-free asset. You could lease it, you could subdivide it, use it as collateral for a loan, capitalize your business, pay for your children's college tuition. But importantly, one could bequeath the land or any profits from it to one's children, which many did do. And so the profits from these 160-acre land grants are the basis for the wealth gap. And we know that more than 45 million white Americans are still benefiting from this largesse today. This is like 25% of our total population of individuals who are 24 years of age and older. So you have, the newly emancipated, Black people who were promised 40 acres and then denied those 40 acres totally. And then you have white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe, anyone who could say that they had not borne arms against the Union, receiving 160-acre land grants. So this is the beginning of, this is the initial source of the racial wealth gap, in the United States. That's just one fork in the road not taken.
So in From Here to Equality, we define reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. And I think that this is directly applicable to the Japanese American experience with restitution. And in our conversations a couple of days ago, John, I think that you emphasized that what was really crucial to many of the Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated during World War II unjustly was the acknowledgement or the apology that was provided finally by the United States government. But the second component is redress, and there was a form of redress that took place under the American Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which was the provision of $20,000 payments in restitution. And we're going to argue that in the context of the Black American case, that second component, redress, is probably takes on a greater significance than it did in the context of the Japanese American case. And then finally, we refer to closure, which is a settling of accounts or a coming to terms between the culpable party, in this case, the United States government, and the victimized community. What this would mean is the victimized community would make no further claims for redress on the culpable party unless there was a renewal of the atrocities that were relevant, or there was the inauguration of a new set of atrocities. Otherwise, the debt would be settled. And this is in the context of Black American reparations. This is a 155-year-old debt that exists as a consequence of the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised. Now, in terms of arriving at a measure of the magnitude of redress, we argue in From Here to Equality that the most critical economic indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy in the United States is the racial wealth gap, the difference in wealth between Black and white Americans on average. And we argue that the reason why this is a critical indicator is because it captures the policy consequences of the promotion of white wealth accumulation in the United States, coupled with the denial of Black wealth accumulation in the United States. And the magnitude of this differential is, for the average Black and white household in the United States, is a difference of $850,000 in net worth. This corresponds to a circumstance in which Black Americans constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess 2.5% of its wealth. This is not exclusively because of there being a handful of extraordinarily wealthy white billionaires, although there are a handful of extraordinarily wealthy white billionaires. But a statistic that is really revealing in this context is the fact that 25%, or 1/4 of all white households, have a net worth in excess of $1 million, while only 4% of Black households have a corresponding net worth. So our objective in terms of the economic dimension of a reparations plan is to bring the Black share of population into conformity with the Black share of wealth, or at least to do that. And this would require an expenditure of $10 to $12 trillion, which is substantially larger than the amount that was dedicated to restitution for the Japanese American community.
You know, as I was reading about trying to find a way to close that wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, as you discuss it, one of the things that sort of struck me is there are people who will argue that what you're basically advocating is a distribution of wealth, a redistribution of wealth. And I mean, obviously that's not what you're talking about, but that would be an argument that I can hear members of Congress, for example, bringing up. And the question is, why should we do that? But my experience is, if you can justify how you come to those numbers, it makes your job not a lot easier, but it certainly mutes a lot of the arguments against you. There are various ways you talk about of coming to some formula to determine how much money there should be for Black reparations. Our number was, we came up, my organization, Japanese American Citizens League, came up with a figure of $25,000. But we had no basis for the amount, because basically it was to say, this was for the loss of freedom. And how do you calculate how much that's worth? And so it became a symbolic number. And what I see in your book is that you actually calculate based on the data and the historical data and accounting for inflation and adjusting to the current period. Just about every single one of them comes out in the trillions. And so, you know, that raises the typical redress question. Why should we pay for something that happened so long ago? And to pay that much money, and where's that money going to come from?
Well,
I guarantee you, you're going to face that question.
Oh, sure.
Oh, yes.
You have it in your book.
It is absolutely a question that we hear. You know, I think Fanny said earlier, you know, we frame the conversation not just as an exploration of slavery reparations, but looking at, you know, these three different epochs of our country's history. You know, certainly slavery is a crucible from which all else flowed, but then you have nearly 100 years of Jim Crow or American apartheid, and then there is the litany of you know, abuses that are continuing today. We have discrimination in housing and in employment, in health disparities, mass incarceration, police violence against Black people. There's and then of course there's the racial wealth gap itself. These abuses, these atrocities are continuing. We didn't talk at all about, the near century of white terror activities that occurred from the end of Reconstruction through the 1940s. You had said, echoed a comment that many people have made, that Reconstruction was this kind of dysfunctional period. Reconstruction was an incredibly potent and important time for our country. This was this brief moment in these 7 mystic years, as W.E.B. Du Bois, termed them, where we did have co-governance of Blacks and whites. This is also a point where we get, for the first time, as a consequence of the influence and the insistence of the Black legislators, this is when we first began to see public education for Black and white children. That did not exist in the Southern states before you had Black legislators. They also pushed really hard for similar, if not identical, capitalization for Black and white schools, both for the physical plants as well as the salaries of the teachers. This is something that was not at all the case, and making sure that the tax bases were sufficient to support the children in schools. We should study Reconstruction more. There's a lot to learn from it. But what we begin to see in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, where there was a coup, you had a significant number of Blacks who had been elected to public offices. And the largest Black newspaper in the South, the North Star, was published there. A significant number of individuals were not wealthy, but they were visibly well off, which might have been, the thing that did them in. But all manner of white citizenry, not just in Wilmington, but across the state, came together to put an end to that co-governance model. So this is not something that we want to have continue into the 21st century. That's one of the earliest, but you have Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, and Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, Ocoee, Florida. Ocoee, one day, dozens of Black people were murdered. And this is because this was on election day, and they deigned to vote. And local whites decided that no, this is not going to happen. You're not going to. Not only are we going. They didn't just stop with trying to persuade them to vote for another candidate. We're going to make it so that you'll never vote again in your life. So I think the historical data is something that we don't really talk about, in part because we're not really that familiar with it. Many of us, I think. And that was a discovery that we kept having ourselves over and over again.
As a sidebar, I think there were upwards of approximately 100 of these massacres that took place, north and south, east and west. They typically resulted in grievous loss of Black lives, destruction of Black property, or in many instances, the actual seizure and appropriation of Black property by whites so that it became theirs. And these massacres never were subjected to a national commission or a national report like the Kerner commissions in the 1960s that addressed the urban unrest that had taken place during that decade. So, and then we have states like Oregon, where there was actual legislation that excluded Blacks from being in the state. So you probably heard the expression a sundown town, where Black folks have to be out of the town by the time that the sun goes down. Well, you could describe Oregon as even more than a sundown state, because you couldn't be there during 24 hours of the day. So, yeah, I mean, there's an extraordinary history of brutality and exclusion that dominates the American landscape. And we think that, it makes it fairly clear that there should be a plan for reparations that is dedicated to Black American descendants of US slavery. And I guess the other point I'd like to make is there is a sense in which this is redistributive, but it's not redistributive necessarily by confiscation of anybody else's wealth. So you can have a redistributive mechanism where you don't necessarily take wealth from somebody else to provide it to the group that is the target for compensation. And this is contingent on having a plan of allocation of the funds that does not necessarily require you to increase taxes. And in the final chapter of the book, we talk about ways in which you could finance a reparations program for Black American descendants of US slavery without necessarily increasing tax rates on any Americans.
And that's really convincing as I read through that. You can tell that was written by an economist because it's the way it lays it all out. But it's very, it's convincing because when you talk about payments in the trillions, it will scare people. And, I have an experience here walking my dog, talking to someone about Black slavery. We just got into this conversation. And I said, well, it's going to cost, it's going to cost money. And I think it's an owed debt to compensate for all that's gone wrong in this country. And he said, but where do you get that kind of money? And I said, the government can write a check. I mean, where do you think your stimulus, COVID stimulus money came from?
Yeah.
It didn't come out of your taxes, didn't come out of some other agency. The government, there's a way, there's a fund there. The government can find the money.
Yeah,
and it's not like it's going to be from the wealthy.
The only danger really is whether or not you're going to generate inflation by the additional federal spending. And so you have to be careful, and you have to design your proposal, your plan in an appropriate fashion to minimize the inflation risk.
Right now, there is a plan, or there is a legislation for this, and it's HR 40, which is, I don't know how far it's going to go. It has some 20 odd sponsors on it, a far reach to 218 votes it would need. And the concept is to have a congressional commission. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how that commission ought to function, or if as a commission, the way it's set up, you think it can help achieve what you're trying to achieve.
And so I'll start, and I know Sandy will jump in. To our knowledge, HR 40 has about 120 sponsors.
Oh, it does
at this
now.
point.
Oh.
There was a big push, Juneteenth 2019. This was the point at which the House Judiciary Committee had hearing, a one-day-long hearing, and within maybe about 4 weeks or so of that event, the numbers began to rise. But they have leveled off, though, in the meantime. But yes, HR 40 is legislation that was initially introduced in 1989 by John Conyers, late John Conyers. And, we and, many others had assumed that the legislation had just been lying dormant, all those years. But in fact, it's been revised substantially. I will say too, Sandy was asked to provide testimony for at those hearings. He wasn't able to attend in person, but did submit his written testimony. And it was interesting. We watched part of the proceedings, and we were struck to see how many of the individuals were speaking either pro or, for or against the idea of reparations, but we did not hear anyone speak to the actual content of the bill. And Sandy's testimony, which perhaps he'll talk about a little bit later, spoke specifically to some of the problems with the legislation. And for us, any effective reparations program needs to do at least three things. It needs to establish who the eligible recipients are. It needs to identify the racial wealth gap, its elimination as a target. And also it needs to indicate that the way that the reparations program, the payments will be made, will be direct payments to the eligible recipients. And so HR 40 does none of those things as written. And when we began to look at the legislation, we discovered it's had several permutations. It wasn't even always called HR 40, which was a surprise to us. Right. And it appears that two of the organizations that had close connections with Representative Conyers in COBRA and NARC possibly learned some of, made some changes in the legislation as a consequence of, what they learned from the Japanese American redress case. The number of the commissioners dramatically increased. I think it began at 7, yeah, and then it jumped to 13. There's a notation that the additional 6 folks would be possibly recommended from these organizations or like organizations. And so in a way, they were kind of writing themselves into the legislation. Suddenly we see a notation that the commissioners would receive GS 18 level compensation, which is about $200,000, which struck us as really odd. Like, why? This is a sacred mission. Why would you be, insisting on, why would you? It sits on pay. Why would you put that in the legislation? There's, the report, that the commissioners would generate. There's very little in the way of guidelines or structure for the report, and there's no horizon. There's no end time. There's no instruction that they should, complete their work in, 18 months or 2 years.
Well, they have to report.
But they have to make a report to Congress, but they don't necessarily have to deliver their findings, the final report within that period of time. And so, we're just kind of wondering, if part of the motivation for, these changes would, you don't want anything there that's going to deflect them from their work. But you worry that they might deliberate for several years, before a report is made available, and then how they determine reparations would look. And one of the groups actually talks about was it the 10 points? No, 10-point plan. It's the international. NARC that has a 10-point plan. And one of them they're talking about reparations going to the African continent. But also that some other entity would manage these funds on behalf of Black people. National Reparations Trust Authority, as opposed to making the direct payments to these eligible recipients. So HR 40, as written, is deeply problematic, and we would hope that legislation would be revised or a new legislation written in its stead.
I think it's important that we do, in fact, have a commission that would be parallel to the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. But I don't believe, and I think we share this view, that HR 40 is the vehicle to produce an effective commission along those lines.
One of the things we were really careful about when we pursued this commission strategy, which was in the Japanese American community really unpopular, It was attacked over and over for months and months. But what I saw in the value of a commission is that it would separate from us its work. And one thing about a commission is that it has to have credibility, and it has to have an end product, what its goal is going to be, and what its charges are. So when we talked about having input into this commission, we were warned, keep a distance on it. And we had this internal debate for hours about, do we want to get a Japanese American on this commission, just to make sure it did what it was supposed to do. And quite honestly, there was a lot of argument against it, because one of the things we face is this charge that we're always controlled by Tokyo. There's some kind of nefarious tie that we have with Tokyo. And since this was an American issue that took place on American soil, we wanted this commission to be, it was a federal commission, and that it would be a blue ribbon commission with very distinguished citizens. And we, in the end, decided that we wanted one Japanese American on there. And quite frankly, it was to be the back door that I could get information from. But as it turned out, he told us he wasn't going to talk to us anymore, not until the job was done. But it served the purpose. But what was important for the commission is that it came out with findings that were not arguable, because it wasn't a decision, or it wasn't a conclusion they came to based on our insisting that there be that. And I think one of the really important factors for us was that we only had one out of 9 commissioners who was Japanese American. And he was a judge and was very trusted and very highly regarded. And that was really important to us, that it had to be an objective body, not vulnerable to any kind of influence from us. I do have to say that I did talk to the commissioners as they deliberated the amount of money they were going to recommend. That I felt free to do, but in terms of the factual findings, we had absolutely no contact with them over that. And so they issued the report, and once the report came out, that's when I started lobbying the commissioners about what they were going to recommend as remedies. So to me, it's problematic if you have a commission where people can accuse it of being self-serving, because if almost 50% of the members on the commission are from reparations advocacy organizations.
Right.
Of course, you know what the findings are going to end up being, or are likely to be, unless those other 7 commissioners are very strong against that. But, I mean, the evidence is there. And your book it's a litany of all the wrongs done to Black America. And so I see the structure of itself problematic as well on HR 40. And most commissioners do not get paid. If they do at all, it's usually around a GS4. If you look at Title V, GS4 runs, I think, around $25,000, $26,000 a year, the total amount. So it's a very modest compensation. But in our case, we said no one gets anything other than expenses. And that was the only cost for any of the commissioners. And, my concern is those who are halfway convinced, or those who are opposed to this issue, are going to say it's a done deal for this commission, because if it gets formed the way it's designed in the language of the bill, it has no conclusion that it can come out with other than there is a need for reparations. And it has this appearance, Washington, perception really is reality. It becomes the reality. And that, I think, is going to be the problem with a commission like this. And it will make it an easy target for members of Congress who don't want to support it or who are really opposed to it. That's the one thing I think they'll target. And my experience is that the less you have that they can criticize about the body itself and the work, the better your chances are, because they're going to be looking for the cracks in this whole process of the legislation. And I can see that. I mean, it's bigger than a crack. It's it's big enough to drive a truck through. So that's where the attack is going to be, on that particular part of it. But it's a long process. It's difficult. We had a commission that finished its work. We introduced the bill, and it was another 5 years. And we weren't dealing with the amount of money that you're going to be looking at with the legislation that evolves finally out of this process. I think we need to go to questions. I haven't been looking at the questions on the side.
I saw one that I will respond to. One person asked, why do we start with 1776? And I don't know if they were thinking perhaps we should start with 1524 or 1619. But for us, the culpable party for making reparations to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is the federal government. And the Republic was founded in 1776. So, certainly there were many, atrocities and abuses that had happened before that time. And I think, HR 40 even makes reference to that. But if you are talking about the bill for the federal, for the U.S. government, you would have to start at 1776. HR 40 includes 1619 in its text.
In addition, I think there was a question about what the criteria would be for eligibility for reparations.
Mm-hmm.
And from here to equality, we advance two criteria. The first is what we refer to as a lineage standard. So an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And then the second is what we refer to as an identity standard. And so an individual would have to show that for at least 12 years before the enactment of a reparations plan or the enactment of a study commission for reparations, that they self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. And so the premise here is that the eligible recipients should be individuals who are living descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States, but more specifically, Black American descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. And that's why we introduced those two criteria.
A couple of questions. One is that difficult to do? And I'm assuming that with all the computer programs, it makes it a bit easier, but I don't know. And the other question is, why the 12 years?
You want to go on that? Yeah. Sorry.
One of the things that we have suggested is that, the Reparations Commission established an agency that was populated with genealogists who could assist individuals who are attempting to make a claim, help them to do the research on their families, bring the materials that you have, documentation that you have, and then they would help them, work backwards to determine whether or not they were eligible. And the second piece, 12 years. So initially we were thinking 10 years. Again, sort of, an arbitrary number. But it occurred to us that, 12 years is 2 senatorial terms. But the idea is, that we were, hoping to forestall individuals who, opportunistically might decide that they were Black, having lived their lives as not Black, but to do what you could to prevent that from occurring, that kind of activity.
Let me add that I think we think it's fairly easy to meet the second standard, which is the identity standard, because an individual simply could make public their response to the race question on the census form.
For us, the eligibility question became really important as we pushed this issue forward. And it began very early for us because we included everyone affected by the government's actions. Any Japanese person who was affected, and that included people who were kidnapped out of South America, Japanese who were living down there. They were not American citizens, and that became a problem to the point that it would have jeopardized the bill for us moving forward. And so we had to make a decision while the commission was still operating to exclude what we call Japanese Latin Americans. And we realized that the eligibility became extremely important because of the internal fights we had within the community. There are those who say we never should have taken the JLAs out of the bill. There were different factions within the community of, for example, veterans who volunteered during the war despite having lost all their rights and joined the military, fought for the United States, and lost a lot of good friends. And there were those who resisted the draft and said, let my family go and I'll serve. And then there were those who renounced their citizenship. I mean, there were whole groups of people, not in large numbers, but certainly the veterans, they were the largest. And so they were saying to me, you cannot allow the resistors to get reparations, and promised that they would raise hell if they did get any kind of consideration. And what it all came down to were the battles that were being fought from the wartime period, but were never forgotten. And what we didn't keep in mind in our own community is that none of this would have happened had the government not violated our rights and put us into these prisons. So it wasn't that one side was right or wrong. Everybody did what they felt conscious they had to do. But I found that creating that sort of broad eligibility, if the bill were to move forward, was really important early on. So when you talk about descendants of slaves, that automatically puts an end, I don't know if I call it an end date, but it excludes people who came here after, say, 1940 or the 1950s, and someone who's Black comes to the United States, because I think there's always a tendency to be all inclusive, to say that, yeah, they weren't descendants of slaves, but they had a lot of problems. They faced a lot of discrimination despite not having that history. But the more you can define it, I keep wanting to say the easier it is, but the more you have to argue for, because I can tell you every point you push forward, the members of Congress are going to find a reason to resist it. So the eligibility is, at the very outset, is really important on this issue.
We're aware that with rare exception, Blacks from the Caribbean and from the continent did not come to the US until after the 1970s. So you're talking about, less than 1% of the population to begin with. That's something that people just, are not necessarily aware of. Prior to the 1970s, there just weren't any legal, African immigrants to or Caribbean, African immigrants to the United States.
Yeah. And those who were here were concentrated primarily in New York City and Miami, Florida.
Right.
Those were the two locations. Yeah. And many of those folks intermarried with Black Americans, and so their descendants would be eligible. Yeah. So
and they themselves would not be, but their descendants would be. But Sandy has a.
Well, there's a question in the chat from Scott Wilson, I think. With respect to the racial wealth gap, how much of that gap do you attribute to 20th century policies such as redlining, restrictive covenants, and FHA mortgage insurance biases? Given a large proportion of most people's wealth is held in the equity in their homes, do you see an avenue for reparations by investing in Black homes and neighborhoods? First of all, we certainly think that the gap in wealth is at least in part attributable to the home buying policies that were discriminatorily applied in the 20th century. And we would add to the list that's offered here the discriminatory application of the GI Bill, where white returning veterans from World War II got substantial support for making home purchases as a stepping stone to entering the middle class, in contrast with returning Black veterans who were largely excluded from the benefits of the GI Bill. In fact, I guess in the most exclusionary example, in the state of Mississippi, out of 3,000 some returning veterans from World War II, only 2 Black veterans received the benefits that are associated with the home purchasing subsidies of the GI Bill. So I would add that to the list here. But I think we also have to be careful not to overestimate the significance of home equity as a component of the racial wealth differential. Because when we start talking about people who are in the upper 25% of the wealth distribution, then home equity becomes far less important as a significant component of their total assets. And in fact, there are communities with relatively low rates of home ownership that actually have extraordinarily high levels of wealth. There's an example that emerges in Los Angeles, where the Asian Indian population actually has a lower rate of home ownership than the African American population. At the time in which this survey was conducted, Asian Americans had, Asian Indians specifically, had a 40% home ownership rate, while African Americans had a 42% home ownership rate. So we're talking specifically about Asian Indians. And so we would think on the basis of that the wealth of African Americans would be slightly higher than the wealth of Asian Indians, but this isn't true. The median Asian Indian household's net worth was $460,000, but it was only $4,000 for African Americans, which would be less than 1% of the figure for Asian Indians. So just want to caution us about an overemphasis or a romanticization of home ownership when there's a wide variety of other assets that are critical in the portfolios of those folks who are in the upper range of the wealth distribution. This would include non-residential real estate. It would include business ownership. It would include financial assets, which are a critical component of the assets that are held by Asian Indians in Los Angeles. And then final question concerns the question of trying to solve the racial wealth gap problem by making allocations of funds at the neighborhood or community-wide level. And we have strong reservations about this type of an emphasis, particularly in a world in which rapid gentrification is taking place, so that the composition of neighborhoods is not fixed or stable. And you could end up in a situation in which you're putting funds into communities that don't actually get into the hands of the individuals who merit those funds. So we prefer a person-based strategy over a place-based strategy.
And I wonder if you did piecemeal.
No, I didn't.
So one of the questions I saw in the chat, I think it was John Hodges, who was asking about, what role communities of faith, colleges and universities, municipalities, cultural institutions might take in this effort. And, some of you may be aware that Asheville, North Carolina recently announced a reparations plan of action, which is somewhat confusing to us because, first of all, they refer only to minorities. They don't specify, Black Americans at all. And, what they have outlined is a program where they're going to make a special effort to, be certain that these minority communities are aware of contracts that might be let by the city, that there are opportunities to become members or to be considered to join city commissions or committees. But these are not, these are programs that I think hopefully will advance the goodwill with these minority communities within Asheville, but they're not going to change the racial wealth gap. Everyone is not going to be eligible to compete for a city contract, even if they should win it. But we're just really concerned that these programs, these action programs, well-intentioned though they may be, are not. They're not going to make a huge difference. Even when you look at colleges and universities and scholarship programs, or efforts to change markers and to de-emphasize the weight and the celebration of slaveholders, none of these things are going to put a dent in that racial wealth gap. If you took all of the budgets of all of cities in the United States and all of the states in the country, you would have a total of about $3.5 trillion. Racial wealth gap is at minimum 10 trillion. So that, even if they were to all agree simultaneously to contribute their budgets to the reparations effort, it would still be $7 trillion too short. And none of those entities would have a budget, with which to carry out their own work. The federal government is the culpable party, and the bill should be addressed to the federal government and not to all these other groups. These sort of piecemeal efforts, I think, in a way, as long as they're called reparations, can we fear have the effect of diluting reparations as an idea, and people will say, oh, well, you've got the Chicago police were made to pay reparations to victims of police involved violence and deaths. You have this program in Asheville. There may be a program for the state of California. You've got your reparations. And so we're just concerned that these lower hanging fruit initiatives are going to deflect attention from the real cause. What we hope is that these individuals, that these organizations, these municipalities would instead use their muscle, use their reputation, their clout to advocate for a national reparations plan. Be in touch with your legislators. Perhaps they would engage a lobbying firm to do a full nationwide full press for a national reparations program. And in the meantime, we would ask that they would look inward and get their own houses in order. There's much that they could do to change the way business is done, whether it's in your family, if it's in your community of faith, on your job, with your ultimate Frisbee group. your artisanal beer group, your book club, who are the thought leaders that you consult when you have issues that need to be determined? When there's an opportunity to make a hire, who are the folks who get those jobs? Do they look just like you? These are things that we can all do while it's like a both and, so while we're looking at our own houses and trying to figure out, how can we bring in other voices so that we're not still in this silo of, we need to break out of the kind of received wisdom and the stories that we have been told and the histories that we have learned. But one way to do that is to be connected to other people in a more meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. And I think Joyce Nakamura, this may be the last question we can do, asked a really sensitive question, which is, why only descendants of slavery when racial and economic oppression and racist policies have affected all African Americans, regardless of lineage and citizenship? And I think the response that we have is that there's something unique about the community that has descended from persons who were enslaved in the United States for two reasons. Their ancestors were brought here forcibly. And in addition, that's the community that has the direct claim for an unpaid debt as a consequence of being descendants from the individuals who were denied the 40-acre land grants. There's no other group of African Americans who have had to bear the cumulative effects of slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing atrocities. And so there's a unique case there. With respect to other members of the Black community in the United States who don't share that lineage, we certainly would encourage people to develop their own unique case for reparations from the US government if they think that that's a credible thing to do. Final point we would make is that we think that Black people throughout the African diaspora all have claims for reparations, but they don't all have claims for reparations from the United States government. That's uniquely specific to Black American descendants of US slavery. Others would have claims on other governments. So for example, Haitians would have a claim on the French government. And that's particularly telling since Haiti was compelled to pay reparations to France, which is absolutely outrageous. That money needs to go back to Haiti with interest.
Well, it's also the fact that the wealth of America, as much wealth as there was and as quickly as it developed, was done on the back of slaves. Without the slave labor, this country would not have developed as it did. Well, thank you, both of you. And thanks again for inviting me to be able to talk with you about this. As I read your book and as I look at this issue, it almost makes me want to go back and fight the battles in Washington. And it's an intriguing idea.
We need you, John.
It's certainly a very necessary thing. I mean, you point out in your book that this disparity of wealth and the gap that is created is in large measure responsible for the views of other Americans on the Black community. And it's obvious as you think about the community's evolvement is that with the discrimination in education, housing, in every sector of society, I don't know how any group could advance very far. And it's that wealth gap. And, I was watching one of the interviews you two did with, I think it was with Williamson, is that her name? And there was,
Williamson, yes.
There was a Black man who got up and said, well, we need to get our own house in order. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was the implication that we need to make ourselves right before people are going to view us as right. And that really I know that attitude is there. It certainly was part of what I saw in our own community. We tend to be hard on ourselves for the wrong reasons. But this is an important issue for this country, and I hope you keep writing about it. You have an incredible book. I wish I'd written that one.
Oh.
For those of you who haven't seen it, let me see if I can get it up close enough. Can you see it?
We have to reciprocate here. There's Redress.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. I really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
talking with you
Thank
again.
You and I hope this is the first of a number of conversations.
Yeah, I do too. I really enjoyed it, and I can't tell you how honored I am to be able to work with you on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
It means a lot to us.
Sarah, it goes back to you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful night.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wait. Oh, wait. It's John may have stayed on for a little minute. You don't know. Wait, don't leave. Don't leave. Yeah. Did he go?
I think John's gone.
He may have gone.
Thank you all. It was a wonderful, enlightening hour and a half. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, Anne's looking.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night. Good night. Oh, Lisa. Okay. Sorry.
I can just end the whole meeting, or I can let you guys say goodbye to everyone.